Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Collegium Institute's event, Anscombe and Moral Prohibition. I moderated discussion lecture with Dr. Candace Vogler. The Collegium Institute is a vibrant intellectual community which serves primarily the University of Pennsylvania and surrounding institutions of higher education, but also has now increasingly after the pandemic, a broader international online audience as far afield as Australia and China at times. And our mission at Collegium partially is to address questions in light of the Catholic intellectual tradition, uppercase C, and also the lowercase c universal Catholic questions. Right? And one of our foremost initiatives in getting at these two sorts of questions is the Anscombe Papers Project. So the Anscombe archives, the papers of Elizabeth Anscombe, another philosopher about whom we'll hear much more later, were thankfully acquired by the Collegium Institute. And over the last year or so, the NEH has given us a grant to digitize all of her papers, which we possess, for ease of access for scholars and enthusiasts of Anscombe all over the world. We're also in the process of developing a database of all of her published works, which was searchable and currently online on Collegium's website. And we're in the process of making the archive, generally speaking, more available to everyone. And for tonight's event, in order to further our goal of promoting Elizabeth Anscombe's thought, I'd like to yield the floor to Dr. John Peter Giulio, who obtained his doctorate at Princeton University and is currently the James N. Perry Fellow here at the University of Pennsylvania for the program in research on religion and urban civil society, or PRUX for short. So.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for being here and everyone on our Zoom feed. We are honored and delighted to have with us this evening, and I am honored and delighted to be the one to introduce a philosopher, a teacher, an author of uncommon depth and distinction. Dr. Candace Vogler is the David B. and Clara E. Stern Professor of Philosophy at the University of Chicago, where she has also served, among many other roles, as the chair of the philosophy department and the co-director of the Master of Arts program in the humanities. The breadth and depth of Professor Vogler's work is simply astonishing. Her research interests range over practical philosophy, especially as it pertains to the namesake of tonight's talk, practical reason, Kant's ethics, Marx, and neo-Aristotelian naturalism. And her numerous publications have focused on everything from ethics and social and political philosophy to philosophy and literature, cinema, psychoanalysis, gender studies, and more. Professor Vogler is also the editor of 3 volumes, including the most recent one, Self-Transcendence and Virtue, and the author of 2 books, John Stuart Mill's Deliberative Landscape and Reasonably Vicious, in which she draws on Aquinas and Anscombe to address the question, is unethical conduct necessarily irrational? She also has a forthcoming book on Anscombe, which we are anticipating with great excitement. Professor Vogler has been recognized with many fellowships and awards from universities and organizations the world over, and has traversed the globe giving scores of talks and seminars on a breathtaking array of topics. But I think it particularly important to highlight the fact that Professor Vogler is an exemplary teacher and mentor, having been recognized with the Niebuhr Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching at her home institution, where she has delivered a rich array of classes on everything from ethics and practical reason to critical theory and medieval metaphysics. In addition to flying the Maroon of UChicago, Professor Vogler is also a Mills College Cyclone, having earned a BA with honors in philosophy there, and a Pitt Panther, where she received her PhD. In lieu of adding Penn Quaker to that list, please join me in welcoming Candace Vogler.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm not going to live up to that, I'm afraid. It's a wonderful thing to be thought so highly of. Okay, and I'm so grateful to get to be here with all of you. I am having an opportunity to really get stuck in at the Anscombe archive right now, and it is helping with this wonderful book. Well, what I hope will be a wonderful book. There's a funny story about the wonderful book I will tell you briefly. Christopher Koop, who was one of Anscombe's students, sent me a very excited email last spring saying, well, and unto us a book is born, because Amazon was advertising my Anscombe book. Right. I was horrified because I have great respect for Christopher Koop. And so I wrote right back and I said, oh my goodness, I have a leave next year when I'm hoping finally to write this book, but no such book exists. Right. And he said, well, my goodness, I had a good laugh over that one. He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. They think I've already purchased this book, so I'll go on in a couple of weeks and review it to get you off on the right foot. Sorry. This is real progress toward the book, though, thanks to everyone here. Okay. Those of us familiar with Elizabeth Anscombe's modern moral philosophy are well acquainted with the way that she heaps scorn upon our efforts, if we still make such efforts, to understand the special moral ought. We may also have got the sense from intention that she thought we could do action theory without bothering much about ethics at all. I mean, people think, oh, Anscombe, she's the one who tells you, get rid of your concern over ethics. What are you trying to do ethics for? That's not, we're nowhere, we're not there. Okay. I mean, after all, her best known example of an action from that work is prima facie murder, and other famous examples from intention and elsewhere often involve murders. Acts of murder are, of course, paradigmatic instances of injustice. She explicitly directs us to thought about justice in modern moral philosophy, where she raises doubt about our work in search of the special moral ought, seemingly suggesting that we're more likely to find what we're looking for if we concentrate on justice. But Anscombe was not an enemy of morality, nor was she an enemy of the understanding that some kinds of actions are always and everywhere impermissible. She's heavy into the moral evaluation of action. The deep reason, I now feel confident, having found this in the archive in a couple places, that she does not like the special moral ought is that she thinks that all human acts are moral acts. If you're going to be talking about a special moral ought, you're acting as though there's only a certain range of things that people do, you know, voluntarily, deliberately, and so on, that are of special moral concern. But she agrees with Aquinas that every act is either morally good or morally bad, period. There's no in between. She thinks this. So any ordinary practical ought that guides our action is always already operating inside the sphere of morality. Her point is that all human acts are moral acts, not that moral evaluation of human acts is somehow problematic. Now, in modern moral philosophy, widely credited with inspiring the area now called virtue ethics, Elizabeth Anscombe suggested that we would do well to revive thought about justice and try to work out how it is that an unjust human being is a bad human being. She thought that this might help us break our fixation on the special moral sense of ought, on moral duty, on moral this and moral that, and invited a return to Aristotle. Well, people have returned to Aristotle, but the central thread in the paper rests on the thought that we can't do philosophical ethics without theorizing moral prohibition. And I strongly suspect that she agreed with Peter Geach on the uselessness of turning to Aristotle for help with that topic. Geach remarked, quote, somebody might very well admit that not only is there something bad about certain acts, but also it is desirable to become the sort of person who needs to act in the contrary way, and yet not admit that such acts are to be avoided in all circumstances and at any price. To be sure, a virtuous person cannot be ready in advance to do such acts, and if he does do them, they will damage his virtuous habits and perhaps irreparably wreck his hard-won integrity of soul. But at this point, someone may protest, are you the only person to be considered? Suppose the price of your precious integrity is a most fearful disaster. Haven't you got a hand to burn for your country or mankind and your friends? This sort of appeal has not, I think, been adequately answered on Aristotelian lines, either by Aristotle or by Mrs. Foote, close quote. In a similar vein, if one reads the lecture Anscombe called Morality, one can't help but notice that its sole focus is on moral prohibition and its coincidence with mortal sin. Anscombe also insisted, without much explanation, that some thinkers who held divine law views of ethics were in a good position to address the matters that non-theists were not. As Christopher Koop put it, quote, the point at issue is not well expressed by reciting the association is all too familiar. I spent several days with him recently, so his voice was creeping in. Sorry about that. All too familiar. If God does not exist, then everything is permitted, said Christopher Todd. It would be less misleading to say that if God does not exist, then nothing is permitted. For the very concept of permitted, where that word has inherited a certain tone, simply falls out of consideration, or at least should do so, close quote. Anscombe's essay was, of course, a sketch meant to be disconcerting, provocative, and suggestive. I'll try to unpack something of what she understood as the conceptual advantage that we had without entirely noticing it when concepts like permitted and prohibited had the context non-theist ethics lacks. Now, contemporary mainstream moral philosophy is not much worried about special moral duties, which, unlike those duties one has on the job, at home, or in the trenches, I guess, must be discharged, easily can come into conflict, and are therefore apt to generate situations in which, as some philosophers still say, one is bound to fail to do as one must. My colleagues are not especially worried about special moral reasons that automatically outweigh other sorts of reasons, where the other sort used to be marked as merely prudential, by which people meant interested and appropriately calculating, not like prudentia or something, just interested and appropriately calculating. Among neo-Kantians, there are still people worrying about understanding the sphere of actions that are neither required nor prohibited, but, as people still say, permissible. And even those philosophers influenced by Anscombe's call to arms tend not to give much thought to actions or duties at all these days, being much more drawn toward the kind of detailed moral psychology derided by Koop, or taking it that they can be in line with work by Anscombe and Philippa Foot if they focus on goods rather than things done for the sake of or in pursuit of some good. Or else, if they work on action and reason, on the supposition that such topics can be pursued in the absence of any substantive traffic with normative ethics, as many contemporary action theorists and meta-ethics try to do. Times have changed. Anscombe was a spur to some of that change. For all that, it's worth pausing to think about the old godless moral philosophy and the shape of the hole in the middle of it that Anscombe thought could be filled by divine law. Anscombe drew central features of her broad picture of divine law ethics from Aquinas on natural law. In this connection, she writes, quote, "Any type of wrong action is against the natural law. Stealing is, framing someone is, oppressing people is. Natural law is simply a way of speaking about the whole of morality used by Catholic thinkers because they believe the general precepts of morality are laws promulgated by God, our Creator, in the enlightened human understanding when it is thinking in general terms about what are good and what are bad actions. That is to say, the discoveries of reflection and reasoning, when we think straight about these things, are God's legislation to us, whether we realize this or not," close quote. The Creator's ordination governing the whole of creation is eternal law. Natural law, as Aquinas stresses, is how the rational animal participates in eternal law. Now, there are various things that we might note about the juxtaposition of her remark about morality and natural law with her complaints in modern moral philosophy. First, contrary to some recent work on natural law, Anscombe suggests that morality and natural law alike are articulated in general thought about good and bad actions rather than through general thought about good. Many contemporary theorists interested in natural law stress things that are good for people to have, to get, to promote, to use, or to enjoy. Anscombe's work tends to focus on what is good or bad for a human being to do. The interest throughout is on voluntary action. Intentional action is a subset of this. She's thinking about both, and she's thinking of, through the distinction between acts of a human being, like, falling down, falling asleep, tripping, those kinds of things, and human acts, which are voluntary and in some sense chosen. How chosen is a complicated question. And she shared Aquinas' thought that an act is good just in case it isn't bad, of an intrinsically bad kind, say, or bad under the circumstances, or done to a bad end. Retaining the traditional distinction between acting well and faring well, this view can allow you to say that many people act well most of the time, or else that hardly anyone ever acts well. The conclusion will depend on how you understand the scope of an act's circumstances and how you distinguish kinds of acts. The focus on acts is consistent in Anscombe's writings and underscores one perfectly ordinary aspect of the legality of divine law ethics. The letter of law normally governs conduct, policy, implementation, and so on. And although neither the sphere of the thou shalt not, nor the sphere of do such and such is, as one says, strictly codifiable, and although one could not have a sound ethics built of nothing but prohibitions, the prohibitions are especially important. Prohibitions, Anscombe urged elsewhere, tend to be so deeply embedded in moral education that it's hard to see how we could have any grasp of central concepts, property, say, or persons, rights or respect, kindness or loyalty, and so on, without practical understanding of the surrounding prohibitions. And if you think about teaching moral education with a kid, like one of the first places it shows itself is in no. No, don't hit your brother. No, do not walk into the street right now. No, we have to use our inside voice. No, no, no. So one of the first ways into the ethical for human beings is actually through a sense of an authoritative no. Right, and that's not accidental, she thinks. Okay. Of course, the relation between specific goods that could be sought in one way or another and the things done in order to secure, promote, make possible, or otherwise aid unimpeded or appropriately limited access to or enjoyment of those goods also belong to ethics, as will concern about emotions and thoughts and attitudes. Anscombe focuses on what is done in pursuing good and avoiding bad. Her topic in the essay from which the natural law quotation is taken is the condemnation of contraceptive sexual intercourse. Her examples in modern moral philosophy include acts whose names imply badness, as an Aristotelian might put it, adultery, murder, bilking, and so on. The elusive special moral ought, the thing she thinks that divine law ethics has, although its scope is much broader than what Hare and company were concerned about, and non-theist ethics can't get, is, she thinks, a notion of obligation which only operates in the context of law. Now, as near as I can tell, although Anscombe makes mention of unspecified Stoics and of Judaism, and although she would not be unsympathetic to turning to Hobbes in thinking about natural law, her understanding of law in general and of natural law in particular comes fairly directly from Aquinas. For Aquinas, law is an ordination of reason for the common good promulgated by him who has care of the community. Prima Secundi 98.4. This definition is meant to be perfectly general. And the natural law as Anscombe was discussing it, meant to be how the rational or intellectual animal participates in the eternal law. But one might wonder why it is that one needs the eternal law in this picture. The question may seem especially acute for readers of Aquinas, who notice that mention of eternal law seems to recede in the distance in his discussion of getting specific precepts of natural law. I mean, perhaps Aquinas is just making a sort of necessary theological nod in God's direction, a nod we can notice and then move past. Stephen Brock gives a nice summary of the troubles that flow in if God steps away from natural law ethics. Quote, an account of natural law that makes no mention of God or of the eternal law still present natural, can such an account still present natural law as law in the full Thomistic sense? It is easy at first glance to give a formulation of natural law in terms of the general definition of law when some reference to divine legislation is permitted. But without such a reference, it becomes difficult to see how to apply almost any of the elements of the definition of law to the case of natural law. Who holds the position of the one who has care of the community? Who promulgates natural law? Also, if its author is not God, then the community to which natural law is promulgated can hardly be the universe. So what community takes its place? Toward what common good will it aim? Even the first element of the definition, an ordination of reason, is thrown into some doubt. For by this expression, Aquinas intends a certain kind of command, but there can be no command where there is no commander. And it is at least problematic to say that natural law is a command issued by each man's own natural reason. One problem connected with the question of the community would be that a natural law issued by a man's own reason would be a law that governs exactly one man. A more serious problem arises from the fact that if natural law is a command issued by man's own reason, then it depends upon his choice to pursue the things commanded, But natural law is supposed to consist precisely in the principles of all deliberation, practical judgment, and reasonable choice. Close quote. Well, one might say, Anscombe may go along with Aquinas on this point, and it might be that sufficiently developed theological view that could cope with Aquinas on analogy in such a way that we had a good account of the relevant sort of command, a clear understanding of the difference between, say, God's command that A sacrifice his only son, having promised that A would father many generations, the sort of command that is not general, and general matters that members of the Anscombe Geach family are apt to treat as descriptions of the order in creation, and some account of obeying a command such that I could be said to be obeying God in avoiding wronging my fellow human beings without knowing that this was a good description of what I was doing. I mean, if we had all that and a good story about the sense in which God promulgates law in nature, then maybe we would have a philosophically satisfying, theologically adequate account of properly moral obligation as Anscombe understands this. But that is a tall order, and it is not a project that Anscombe seems to have undertaken. In short, it is not as though simply adverting to divine law is enough to make sense of how it was that divine law had a grip on our special obligation to our fellow human beings. Sticking with the special, just in the sense of conspecific. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of obligation. It could be that the sort at issue in what people have thought of as a special moral law, the sort that makes sense of both permissible and prohibited kinds of act, is more likely to find a home in natural law as the way the rational animal participates in the eternal law than it does elsewhere. Brock and Anscombe both raise strong objections to supposing that we will find much help from neo-Kantian accounts of practical reason, and it won't help to look to positive law because positive law need not track justice. But there are such things as customary obligations, practice-based obligations, contractual obligation. Anscombe does not think that any of these will, on its own, give us much help in understanding morality. Right? And you can just read this off the surface of her litany of complaints against modern moral philosophy. That litany suggests in the background a strong Thomist response. She doesn't stand with introspective moral psychology and social norms. Butler, quote, Butler exalts conscience, but appears ignorant that a man's conscience can tell him to do the vilest things, right? By the same token, considering the second nature of acculturation to social norms, quote, but just as one cannot be impressed by Butler when one reflects what conscience can tell people to do, so I think one cannot be impressed by this idea if one reflects on what the norms of a society can be like, close quote. Neo-Kantian moral theory, here she comes. Kant introduces the idea of legislating for oneself, which is absurd. The concept of legislation requires the superior power of the legislator. On consequentialist moral theory, in coining the term consequentialism and explaining the fault that it names, she takes herself to have shown why it will be useless to try to account for morality as productive of good outcomes. The place of estimating outcomes in ethical judgment is the kind of thing moral philosophy should explain. What we need to explain includes the following ubiquitous teaching of common sense. One is responsible for the bad consequences of deliberate bad acts, but get no credit for their good outcomes. One gets credit for the good consequences of a good act, but when a good act goes wrong, then the fault lies not with the doer or the deed, but with something else. Finally, I think we would have to add that you're permitted to risk more when faced with morally hostile circumstances than you are ordinarily. And in social contract theory, she takes it that the understanding the boundaries of morality takes you beyond anything that could be covered by a contract, right? I mean, I can't sign on to a contract that will oblige your children and their children to do something. It's not. Neither can you. Okay. In modern moral philosophy, Anscombe points to understandings of divine law in the work of unnamed Stoics in Judaism and in Christianity as providing context in which claims about specifically moral obligation and moral ought had a home. Now she thinks all of morality has a home in this kind of divine law ethics, which means the things I do because I'm supposed to pay my taxes, the things I do because hospitality requires it when I have a guest, the things I do because I promised to meet a student for coffee, those kinds of things. Those are all in the ethical as well. Those are perfectly ordinary forms of ought. That I feed the neighbor kids because they're hungry and ought to do so because we've got food and they're hungry. This is a perfectly ordinary ought. It's not outside the ethical. Okay. Okay. She does not explain how exactly she's understanding divine law or how it might or might not to relate to divine commands. She doesn't say which Stoics she has in mind. She doesn't even say what it is that divine law supplied apart from a legislator capable of both setting and promulgating the relevant sort of law that's gone missing in some way that renders philosophic concern over a distinctively moral sense of obligation or a distinctively moral law sort of empty, like a finger pointing upward to nothing there, which is how she sees the state of philosophy and her colleagues and peers. Now, it's no surprise that the essay has come under attack from philosophers who appear to be operating with divergent understanding of the understandings of the character of divine law. What seems to have been at the heart of her writings on specifically prohibited acts, murder, for example, is an invocation of what she names mystical value at various points. In a recent conversation on this topic, Coop suggested at the point we find ourselves adverting to mystical value, it might be better to just admit that we don't know what we're on about. And that she might even have done so if pressed. It's my great hope that she did know what she was on about, that there's not a way to point to that outside of the theological frame, I think. The other term that she uses in marking out this aspect of ethical awareness is human dignity. I expect that it's easier to suppose that we can give an account of human dignity. My sense is that what she's after might better be called sanctity than dignity, if only because she calls the kind of conduct that are not in accord with this core feature of human lives violations, and insists that her topic involves an impregnable aspect of human lives, and urges that although we can violate it, nothing can remove it from the life of even an egregiously violated human being. Terms like indignity and disrespect do not generally carry that kind of weight. Whatever Anscombe was driving at, it is hard to see how we can theorize much about what is morality without taking account of some of this material. Here is one of her lists of things that violate the relevant aspect of human life, which provides for a foundational equality between us. When I call this equality impregnable, I do not mean that it is inviolable. That is, I do not mean that it cannot be violated. It can. Alas, it often has been violated, often now is violated. It was violated in chattel slavery where the slave had no rights, not even the right to marriage, where the husband and wife cannot be sold apart, sorry, where their children sold away from them. It is violated every time people are killed for others' convenience, as the Nazis killed mental defectives, or as in warfare civilian populations are bombed, or when anyone murders his fellow human being, not in anger as deserving death, but for advantage to himself, close quote. I now think that what best fits her remarks on morality, moral prohibition, and the sense in which the dignity of the human being or the mystical value of human life are at the root of justice requires a theological rather than merely philosophical underpinning. It's not that Anscombe was a theologian, she's no more theologian than I am, but the theological framework within which she works is a place to look if we want to understand the way in which she is in favor of morality and respects what one of my colleagues names the awful character of obligation. She takes it that we're best able to understand these topics if we approach them with a religious attitude. Quote, a religious attitude may be merely incipient, prompting a certain fear before the idea of ever destroying a human life and refusing to make quality of life judgment to terminate a human being. Or it may be more developed, perceiving that men are made by God in God's likeness to know and love God. The love of God is the direction of the will to its true end. The human heart and will are set on amenity. They may also be set on what is just. That is, when it comes to dying, set in acceptance of life, which is God's gift, and of death as it comes from him, close quote. In short, Anscombe is not against morality. She's not even against taking it that considerations of justice often concern morality, and she's happy to connect these topics with appropriate concern for the appropriate forms of respect for our fellow human beings. I take it that she thinks that these concerns find their proper place in a theological frame. In conclusion, I'll turn to a theologian on the topic of God's providence and the eternal law. Aquinas writes, quote, it is evident that only the rational creature is directed by God to his actions, not only in accord with what is suitable to the species, but also in accord with what is suitable to the individual. Each thing appears to exist for the sake of its operation. Indeed, operation is the ultimate perfection of a thing. Therefore, each thing is ordered to its action by God according to the way in which it is subordinated to divine providence. Now, a rational creature exists under divine providence as a being governed and provided for in himself, and not simply for the sake of his species, as is the case with other corruptible creatures. For the individual that is governed only for the sake of the species is not governed for its own sake, but the rational creature is governed for his own sake, as is clear from what we have said. And so only rational creatures receive direction from God in their acts, not only for the species, but for the individual, close quote. It's a way of thinking about the Imago Dei. This is, I take it, the understanding of specifically human life that is at issue in Anscombe's understanding of morality. That's what I have.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was quite a stimulating discussion, and I must apologize to everyone that not only did I get to introduce, I'm also spoiled with the task of popping off the first two questions to get the ball rolling. So the first thing I wanted to follow up on was coming off of something you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk, Peter Geach's remark about, don't you have a hand to burn for your country or even for mankind? And it seems what's happening there is, well, Aristotle doesn't fill that gap. We can't get there by following Aristotle. So there needs to be something else to close that gap and explain how those moral prohibitions are intelligible. But on the other hand, there's this other group of people, modern thinkers, who at that moment just veer off in an entirely different direction. Those who think about something like the problem of dirty hands. I was thinking about Max Weber's Politics as a Vocation, which even has a kind of religious undertone where by doing the immoral thing, even perhaps violating God's law, you are taking sin and upon yourself and sullying your own soul and even perhaps suffering for it. And there's even something noble and heroic about it. It seems for Anscombe, something has gone terribly wrong there. And I would wonder if I could pick your brain about what has gone so awfully wrong with that kind of thinking.
Great question. Thank you. Well, for starters, you could start here. If you don't, there's still a lot of people who do not think there are moral prohibitions. Obviously, Weber's one of them. Like I could heroically, I don't know what, mutilate all the children in the local daycare, even vivisect them or something, because that's the only way to prevent that evil being from vivisecting all the children in all the daycares all over the country, right? So I will do the vile thing to protect everybody else. If you think that way, you just don't accept that there are moral prohibitions, right? But that also means that your ideal moral agent could understand himself to be obliged to do anything, right? There is no action bad enough that you can't easily construct the philosophy example on the pattern I just gave you for vivisecting the kids in the local daycare. And you could be stuck with a position that holds that it's not just lamentable to give in at that point and do the egregious thing. It's actually required. It's actually required. At that point, there's a really fundamental aspect of basic understanding of treatment of your fellow human beings that has just left the park. It's just not there anymore. And you don't have the resources theoretically to make sense of it. And it's very, try to imagine a world in which it's genuinely the case that anything, you could be required to do anything in sufficiently weird circumstances, right? One of my colleagues at a talk on moral prohibition I gave at the University of Chicago said, well, but does it help that it almost never happens that way? That you almost never find yourself in a philosophy example. I'm like, not really. What it is that it's actually difficult, but I think vital to the understanding of the whole operation of practical reason to accept that there are such things as moral prohibition. And for what it's worth, the kind of moral knowledge I insist that all my students have walked in a room already having is about prohibition, right? They may have doubts about a lot of difficult issues, right? They got no doubts that genocide is never okay. Like not even if it's like a filthy little people that nobody would miss who are eating up resources that the better people could use in good ways, right? Genocide, never okay, right? Rape, never okay. No way it could be okay. So they have, and then they are impressed by the fact that you can tell that you've got you're looking at something that's a prohibited act type if you look at the amount of energy people have put into trying to understand what counts as an instance of that type. So the kind of, I mean, when I was a little girl, it was not the case that marital rape was a recognized category. It was not possible for a spouse to rape a spouse because obviously in getting married, you gave each other conjugal access to your blah, blah, blah. How could it ever happen that one could rape the other? The kind of energy that went into saying, no, 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 there are some spouses who are getting raped inside a marriage and actually arguing for that. That's an attempt to understand in a different way the set of things that are instances of this kind of act, right? Genocide, initially like used to cover what Nazis did with Jews and gypsies and so on, but comes to cover things that people do that later, that conquerors do to First Nations people in all kinds of places by not letting them teach their language and culture to their children. So tried to attack the gen by preventing the next generation from being carriers of the culture by which they understand themselves. Those are, I mean, to suppose that there aren't any such things as moral prohibition is to suppose that there could be an okay genocide. Morally, right? Like it would be the right thing to do, the best response, right? And would not be wrong. That's the cost of denying this point. And I think you lose the possibility of adequately theorizing ethics if you can't accept prohibition. Now, grounding prohibition isn't easy. I've tried a bunch of ways to do it without a theological prayer. I've never succeeded. But trying to do without them, I think, puts the person who wants to be an ethicist in an impossible position. Does that help?
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And the other question I had, and this was floating through my mind as you were bringing up issues of divine law and divine command, was Plato and his Euthyphro concern of the good and will. You know, the gods will what is good because it is good, or is it good because the gods will it? And we actually had Anscombe. We actually had a seminar at Collegium a few summers ago when we read Anscombe on piety and on this issue. And I wonder how you think Anscombe in pursuing kind of stopping up that hole with the theology would deal with this issue, and to what extent we have gone beyond even morality into something like piety in talking about theological basis for moral prohibition.
It really depends on what you think about, like a Thomist account of natural law, really. You're dealing with a Thomist account of natural law. You've got something that's actually starting from natural inclinations. You're starting from the thought that we are the intellectual animals. So we're the highest kind of animal and the lowest kind of intellect. Right? And that puts us in the position where we have to figure out what to do. And natural law provides us with directedness in that. If you think that there is such a thing as synderasis, which I do, you suspect that we all come into the world directed to specific good and away from specific bad. And what happens in growing up is that basic directedness becomes articulated, and you learn action types, and you learn the kinds of inwardness that go with the relevant action type, and that is normal development for a human being. So, I mean, and you think that this law is promulgated in nature,
My hero on these points is actually Stephen Brock. I think he's really great on natural law. The Light That Binds is his new book. It's terrific. I strongly recommend it. But basically, he's thinking that this is promulgated to us in nature in our own tendencies to move toward and away from things, and also in what we learn from other animals, the animals that aren't intellectual animals. I mean, he thinks that part of how a little kid learns about action is by watching the non-human animals and what they're up to and deciding what looks good or bad, that they're going toward what's good or bad for them, and that the humans are going toward what's good or bad for them, and all this stuff. So if that's the view you take, you aren't, you're talking about a creator and a legislator at the same time, right? Who's responsible for the order in the cosmos, right? And that extends to things like the order of life and for different species of living things. For Aquinas, it's even going to extend to things like the order found in the movements of inanimate things. I mean, I don't see where in creating a kind of being, that there can be a substantial kind, especially of living things, is already built into that is a sense of the thing's good, right? And it's how, you know, I mean, it's true, what's true of substances generally, right? It's true for good. So there's not really a place for the Euthyphro question to get any leverage, you know? Did God decree that the geese shall migrate because it was good, or was it good because God decreed it? It's kind of like, you're talking about a creator legislator here, where to create is to create an ordered being, right? And it's not clear that you're talking about the kinds of things there are if that's not part of it. So I don't think there's a place for the Euthyphro problem to get much leverage on a certain kind of Thomas natural law. The other kinds of natural law views, yeah, you could get all the leverage you wanted to and knock the thing to pieces. Those tend to be the ones where they're sort of like, the bit we can leave out, that would be God. That's the bit we don't need to make sense of natural law. The most popular variations right now are the sort who think, well, we can't do without friendship, but God, it's completely unimportant to the system. Sorry.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, now you can always spare it of me. So open it up to the room. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I have a bunch of questions, so I got to prioritize them. I'm really interested in Philip Foot's work and taking the kind of Aristotelian route, which Anscombe opens the door to non-moral philosophy. Although kind of at the end of the essay expresses some doubt about how people coherent concept of human flourishing. So I was wondering, given that Foot carried on that work for so many years after the publication of that article, what Anscombe, I don't know, I'm not aware of any published criticism of Foot's work, but what would be, I guess, her biggest doubt about that kind of approach to grounding absolute prohibitions?
I think she thinks that Foot doesn't have the means to do it. The stuff about ruining your hard-won integrity of soul is directed at that kind of thing, at a Footian kind of view. So, I mean, what she says about the kind of sort of solidarity of among the virtuous that she imagines, right? I wouldn't be participating in that solidarity among the virtuous if I did the egregious thing, that good might come of it. But she doesn't have the theoretical means of explaining why it is that I can't do evil, that good might come of it. Right, which is what you need. You need a way of saying that it's always a miscalculation if you think that you can do good, do evil, that good might come of it, or that greater evil might be diverted, or something like that. And what Geach was complaining about is that it's not clear that she has the theoretical basis for that. How are you going to get that out of just her kind of like, okay, when I'm in a mean, I won't be in a mean mood. I mean, actually, I miss Philippa. She was great. And she's brilliant. There's a slight tendency in Foot to suppose that if we talk about the kinds of goods, distinctive goods that human beings enjoy, that we can somehow pull a certain kind of theory of rationality or excellence out of that, that won't leave room for egregious action. And it's not clear how. I'm not sure that you can just take an understanding of a whole range of human goods and a strong suggestion that some of these are unavailable to the vicious, and have that be enough to give you grounding for moral prohibition. Because moral prohibition is really strong. Moral prohibition is the kind of view that like, the private killing of a beastly person who's terrorizing the neighborhood is wrong and never to be done. Right? I'm never permitted to plot the demise of the person who's terrorizing the neighborhood and everybody's rightly afraid, right? That's a really strong claim. And it's not clear how natural goodness is going to explain why that's never allowed. In what sense is it naturally other than good if with nothing but the interests of the families in the neighborhood and my own, I mean, the neighborhood spirit in general, I'm going to get rid of this fiend? Why isn't that permitted under the doctrine of natural goodness? And it was sort of like Aristotle would mean something more to say than the name implies badness, to show you why that wasn't permitted for him, even though he thinks he, like Aquinas, unsurprising connection, believe that there are absolute prohibitions, but there are no absolute positive requirements tied to kinds of acts, because it's not in your power to make it the case that the circumstances won't work in such a way that what's usually a good thing to do becomes bad here and now. But they both accept that there are actual prohibitions. It's just that Aquinas has a story to tell about where that comes from, and it's not clear that Aristotle does. And Foot inherits this aspect of Aristotelianism, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks so much. You briefly touched on how some sense of mystical value might undergird a sense of prohibition for you. for Anscombe, and that made me think a bit about Durkheim and also William James' Priorities of Religious Experience, where
Yeah.
you can kind of actually use those experiences as data points for the mystical. How do you think there might be, like, I guess, potential for actually grounding prohibitions in those experiences? And do you think it's kind of harder to do that work now that, you know, people are more and more disenchanted?
That's a really great question. My reading of Anscombe's responses to James on this topic is not due for another day and a half. So I don't have her response to William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, the tip of my fingers. And she will object to treating these as data points. I think she's going to hold that it's not clear. I mean, what is a data point for Imago Dei? Which is kind of what you would need. What would I use as a data point to say, Mr. Chile over there, clearly Imago Dei. I can see it, I can feel it. Like, and what would it look like if it was missing? Right. So when she talks about having a religious attitude, she talks about she means a general sort of constellation of different ways of responding to other people and to circumstances in life that are like the ones you might have if you were, you know, a theist of some kind. Like you're feeling the operation of something transcendent in the ordinary. And in that sense, you know, part of the reason she's going to talk to James is because it seems like that's exactly what William James is trying to track. That she's going to disagree with them is just my hunch, because like, what does it mean to find a data point here? She's going to wonder. And suppose that there is no such thing as finding a data point, because there's no such thing as finding a case where it doesn't hold.
Yes. So if I could pick up from your second question, that would be a really beautiful response. But I don't think I've been able to wrap my mind around it yet. So if you'll forgive my kind of density. But the Anscombe building on Aquinas' understanding of natural law, that you need this ordinance of reason promulgated by divine authority or divine lawgiver, gives you I guess the metaphysical grounds for moral prohibition, the divine law.
That's the hunch anyway.
And that is a stronger grounding for moral prohibition than anything that she suggested Kant was able to provide through kind of more horizontal view of reason across humanity. Right? Okay. But what about Kant's fear, right? Kant's concern that with the divine lawgiver, you not only have a grounding for moral prohibition, right, but you also have a grounding for abrogating the natural law, right? Such that, you know, as he sort of famously argued, right? Because of course he thought this was an issue for folks who follow the scriptures, right? Christians and Jews, right? So in the case of Abraham, right, Kant's response was that if God told him to sacrifice Isaac, he said, "I will not, because it's against the natural law," right? So how can you help tease out a little bit more? I think you've already done so in her exposition of Aquinas, but is there enough? There may not be embedded in this, in the first clause, measure that's an ordinance of reason promulgated by the divine lawgiver to put some limits, right, on what the divine authority would command? Or what can we do with that? I mean, it's like it's very complicated.
Well, it's complicated. I had a weekly long conversation with Stephen Brock about exactly this point, because I was very interested in the material in the ST about the difference between something that could be instituted as a matter of natural law and something that can only be commanded. And Aquinas has a lot to say about that. So it is a principal distinction Aquinas thinks in Aquinas. But you're not going to get it just out of ordinance of reason, right? Especially not in a Thomist view, a serious, like metaphysically, like robust Thomist view, right? Where you think like lowest in the level of the intellects, highest in the animals, and right, that kind of view, where okay, how do I want to go about this? The place in Kant where you find something a little more congenial would be in the material and the practical precepts in the second critique. The practical precept involving the belief in God, which he takes it, I mean, the practical, postulates, that's what I mean to be talking about, the postulates, the three postulates, right? Freedom, the existence of God, right? Immortality of the soul, which he thinks are presupposed in rational action generally. The understanding about the necessary belief in the existence of God is really interesting. Now, it's not a God I could imagine worshiping. It's like Kant's God, who's like super thin, sort of notional in certain kinds of ways, instead of like something you might, sing hymns about or pray to or whatever. It's just this kind of like, I don't know, like the most emaciated Lutheran God you could imagine in a certain sense. But the idea is that if I can't believe that happiness in proportion to virtue is actualizable in a totality for all rational beings, that all rational beings will get to be as happy as they are good, then my own individual moment of denying myself some pleasure because it runs afoul of some moral obligation is no longer appropriately grounded, because my own effort to do duty rather than pursue self-interest, even in little things, is supposed to be an aspect of trying to participate in the world in which happiness in proportion to virtue is realized, right? In order for that to be even possible, there has to be a will big enough to make it actual. No individual will is big enough to make it actual. So you have to postulate God in order for the highest good, which he thinks is at work constantly in rational action and dutiful in the motive of duty, to have any place to get any traction. Like you need the real possibility of the highest good in order to make your own effort at sort of in a shaky way, trying to approximate to it, make any sense at all. That's a kind of place where God is doing a very special sort of work in making ordinary action intelligible, not in securing like moral prohibition, but securing the possibility of an ultimate end in human life or in the lives of rational beings. Okay. Final ends and ethics are not unrelated. And so the way you'd have to try to bring them into some kind of conversation would be around stuff about final ends, I think. But that's not going to give you metaphysical grounding of the sort that you get if you have a full-blown scholastic understanding of substance and the nature of a substance. What makes a thing a substance? Kind of thing. So I don't think, I mean, it's notoriously difficult to make sense of what Kant thinks are ordinations of reason. But the practical postulates give you this sort of bizarre story of the background to what can be an ordination of reason in Kant. So, I mean, I think that's the weird place to look if you want to see how Kant would have to cope with some sort of something roughly equivalent to natural law. You'd have to look at things like necessary concern with happiness and the demand for moral accountability coming together in some way, because those are the only two things he thinks are true of rational beings, right? Moral accountability and desire for happiness.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering how you might tie this to a specific section in the intention that I've been interested. So it's on page 75 to 76, and it's where she talks about how it's not necessarily unintelligible that someone would want to do the evil because it is the good for the person. And then she goes on to say that given these multiplicity of goods, as for reasons against a man's making one of them his principal aim, and whether there are orders of human goods, this question would belong to ethics if there is such a science.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how ironic she's being here, but that question aside, I was wondering if it would be sort of like reasonable to think that her consistent claim is that you would need to have the desire to follow God or the desire to follow some sort of natural law as one's principal aim in order to bring in the following the prohibitions and all the other sort of subsequent desires that follow from like having that as a principal aim.
No, the answer is no. She thinks that, I mean, the incredibly puzzling last couple of pages of on promising and its justice and whether it need be respected in 4.0 internal, I mean, where the first part of the paper is on promising, the second part of the paper is on its justice, and the very, very puzzling last bit is on the sense in which it need be respected in the internal forum. She talks about various things that might be true of somebody who accepts the necessity of doing his word, right? One of them is the person who just thinks, my life is such that it will be spoiled if I act unjustly. That's nothing about having an aim of pleasing God. And the way to think about the relation between natural law and our actions isn't we choose to follow it. Right, that's not the way that goes. It's a very I mean, The Light That Binds, it's a great book. I heartily recommend it. Stephen Brock came out last spring. But that's not the kind of thing that's at issue here. And she, like Aquinas, seems to think that you can explain a whole lot of stuff that people do in terms of natural law, even if they don't believe in God, right? You don't even have to understand that what you're doing is following natural law when you're following natural law. We're on these views. So you don't even have to have a thought about where it comes from. To have a thought that you can't do that because that's one of your fellow human beings. Like, what are you thinking doing something like that with one of your, don't you recognize this person as a person? You know, I mean, the kinds of things that go on when we describe something as inhuman, usually we're touching on something about what you might want to call the dignity of human life, or the value of human life, or the worth of human life, or something like that, which is held to be really distinctive. You know, no matter how much you love your puppy, right? There's something really distinctive about your baby that wins out over the puppy in some metaphysical sense. Sorry, just remembering a
We
horrifying.
have one more question. One more question. Who wants the last question?
Oh, no, there's one question online. Here.
Oh, great. Okay.
So yes, one of our very faithful online participants is wondering if you, Dr. Vogler, could reiterate your closing point taken from St. Thomas in the lecture, right? Of why it's important that norms are not given to the species, but to individual persons, and perhaps how that point relates to Anscombe's views on the matter, what work it does for her.
Okay. The idea is that God's providence doesn't just embrace the humans as such, that some piece of God's providence actually embraces me personally, and that in that humans are different from any other kind of animal. Because God's providence to the horse or the dog or something has to do with the species. God's providence in this case comes just to me. This is one of the ways of thinking about imago Dei, right? The sense in which I am picked out in a personal way, as each of you is picked out in a personal way. That's part of where that connects to what Anscombe is up to, is that she's deeply committed to the idea that there's something about individual human life that is such that it can be violated, but be in a certain sense inviolable. Like there's some quality in the human being's individual life that makes it the case that it retains its value and its importance and its worth and significance, even in circumstances where nothing about the way that the larger world responds to this creature looks like it respects or even recognizes that worth. Okay. Does that do the connection for our faithful?
Yes, that's very well put. And we actually just got another question that came. So is an act of good defined by it moving a person closer to God?
That's a question that's above my pay grade. We really want to, one hopes that one's good actions, as one might put it, cooperate with grace. At the very least, don't impede the operation of grace in the lives of our fellows. This is a deep hope. Right? Some of us pray for this before we start a class. Like, don't let anything I do impede the work of grace in the life of one of the people I'm be working with. But you can't even guarantee that you're cooperating with it. I mean, all you could do is work really hard not to get in the way.
Well, I think with that, and we will once again, please join me in thanking Professor Vogler for her wonderful talk.